Every morning, I woke to the sound of the old clock in the hallway ticking away, its rhythmic beat a reminder that time, for now, still flowed steadily. The faint scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the musty remnants of last night's rain. I stretched in bed, feeling the coolness of the sheets against my skin, and took a moment to listen to the day coming alive outside my window. My small apartment was nestled in a fading building that had seen better days. The peeling paint and worn floorboards told stories of a time when it was vibrant, much like the city around it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and caught a glimpse of the faded posters on the wall, concert memorabilia from bands I loved, but had never seen live. I had my routines, little rituals that anchored me in this ordinary life. I shuffled into the kitchen, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The radio sat on the countertop, a small, crackling device that connected me to the world beyond my walls. I turned it on, and the voice of the morning host filled the space, cheerful yet tinged with a hint of tension. News of political debates and economic forecasts played in the background, but I focused on the comforting sounds of my coffee brewing instead. As I poured myself a cup, I glanced out the window. The street below was beginning to fill with the familiar faces of my neighbors. Mrs. Koval, with her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, tended to her small flower garden, her hands lovingly coaxing life from the earth. Across the street, the Thompsons' children raced after a stray dog, their laughter mingling with the sound of distant traffic. It was a normal day, and I clung to that normalcy as if it were a lifeline. After breakfast, I dressed in my usual attire, a simple blue shirt and faded jeans, the kind of outfit that felt like a second skin. I took a moment to stand in front of the mirror, brushing my hair back and adjusting my glasses. My reflection stared back at me, nothing remarkable, just a face lined with the worries of everyday life. I sighed, wondering if I would ever feel like I belonged in a world that seemed to shift beneath my feet. I grabbed my bag and headed out the door, locking it behind me. The cool air brushed against my skin, and I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The walk to the bus stop was a short one, but it allowed me to observe the world around me. I passed by the bakery where the warm, sweet aroma of pastries beckoned me each morning, but I resisted the temptation, knowing I needed to save every penny for my tight budget. At the bus stop, I joined a small group of familiar faces. There was Mark, the local handyman, who always had a story to tell, though I'd never quite figured out if they were true or just the embellishments of a bored man. Beside him stood Elena, a single mother with 2 children, who juggled her job at the grocery store while caring for her family. We exchanged polite greetings, small moments of connection that filled the silence of our shared wait. As the bus rumbled up the street, I felt a twinge of anxiety. The bus was often late, and I couldn't afford to be late for work. I climbed aboard, squeezing into a narrow seat next to a man reading a newspaper, the headlines blaring about protest and unrest. I caught snippets of conversations around me, people discussing the rising prices of basic goods and murmuring about the latest government decisions. It was unsettling, but I tried to focus on the mundane, the comforting rhythm of my daily commute. I worked at a small bookstore downtown, a sanctuary filled with the smell of aged paper and ink. It was my escape, a place where I could lose myself in the pages of stories far removed from my reality. My boss, an elderly man named Mr. Bennett, was a constant source of wisdom and humor, often sharing anecdotes from his youth as we stocked shelves or arranged displays. "People forget that stories are what connect us," he would say, adjusting his glasses. "In times of trouble, it's the stories that keep us human." I would smile, nodding along, knowing that he was right. But as I flipped through the pages of the latest novels, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the world outside our little oasis. There were whispers of discontent, subtle signs that the air was thickening with tension, even if it hadn't yet reached our doorstep. The day passed slowly, filled with the comforting routine of ringing up customers and recommending books. A few regulars came in, sharing snippets of their lives, laughter erupting over shared jokes. But in the back of my mind, I could hear the distant hum of unease, a reminder that change was looming on the horizon. When I finally returned home, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow through my window. I brewed another cup of coffee, savoring the quiet of my apartment, the soft sounds of the city settling into night. I curled up on the couch with a book, trying to drown out the noise of the outside world. Yet, even in the sanctuary of my living room, I could hear the faint murmurs of conversation from the neighbors, voices tinged with worry and speculation. As I turned the pages, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world I knew was on the brink of something profound. I set the book down, glancing at the clock. It was late, but sleep felt elusive. I wandered to the window, looking out at the street below, where shadows danced in the dim light. I thought of my uncle, who had been a quiet figure in my life, a man of few words but deep scars. I wondered if he had felt this same sense of impending change in his own life, years ago when he faced the shadows of his past. I closed my eyes, allowing the weight of the day to settle around me, but sleep was far from me. The war was whispering at the edges of my consciousness, a reminder that the normalcy I clung to was fragile. Little did I know that soon, the echoes of my uncle's past would come crashing into my present, unraveling everything I thought I knew. The morning light filtered through the dusty window of my apartment, casting a muted glow that felt both comforting and oppressive. The clock ticked steadily, each second a reminder of the routine I clung to. Yet today, there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the familiar aroma momentarily grounding me. But as I took a sip, I noticed my hand trembled slightly, the cup rattling against the saucer. Outside, the usual sounds of the street seemed muted. I could hear the rustle of leaves, but no laughter or chatter from the neighboring apartments. It was as though the world had drawn a breath and held it, waiting. As I peered through the window, the street below appeared almost desolate. Mrs. Koval, who usually tended to her flowers with a fierce passion, was absent. The Thompsons, who never missed a chance to walk their dog, were nowhere in sight. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. I dressed slowly, trying to ignore the strange tension that had crept into my chest. The radio crackled to life, but instead of the familiar morning news, there was a strange silence. I fiddled with the dial, hoping to find a station that would break the stillness, but all I got was static. I turned it off, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The liveliness of the bookshop where I worked felt like a distant memory as I made my way there. Mr. Bennett was already behind the counter, his brow furrowed as he sorted through a pile of returned books. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. He nodded absently, his gaze fixed on a window that overlooked the street. I followed his gaze, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sun shone brightly, yet the brightness felt almost cruel against the backdrop of our growing anxiety. As the day wore on, the atmosphere thickened. A siren echoed through the city, longer and more piercing than usual. It sent a chill down my spine. Mr. Bennett looked up, his expression pensive. "Sometimes they test them for too long," he murmured, almost to himself. I didn't respond, the words hanging in the air between us, heavy with implications. At lunchtime, I stepped out to grab a bite, hoping the bustling market would provide a distraction. Instead, I found the streets eerily quiet. A few vendors were setting up their stalls, but their conversations were hushed, and the usual banter felt strained. I overheard snippets of conversation that made my skin prickle, rumors of soldiers being moved through the area, of people disappearing overnight. A woman stood by a fruit stall, her fingers nervously plucking at the fabric of her blouse as she whispered to a friend about a neighbor who had vanished without a trace. I tried to shake off the unease as I made my way back to the bookshop, but it clung to me like a shadow. Inside, I found Mr. Bennett still lost in thought. He looked up as I entered, his eyes searching mine. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low, as if speaking louder would shatter the fragile atmosphere. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach tightened, and I could feel my heart racing. The day dragged on, each tick of the clock sounding louder, more ominous. I watched as a child outside the window sat on the curb, diligently drawing with a piece of chalk. The images on the pavement were jarring, a tank, a soldier, and what looked like a broken building. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the innocence of his art was marred by the reality he was beginning to understand. I looked away, swallowing hard. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor of the bookshop, I noticed a man in the corner, packing a small bag with hurried movements. He glanced around nervously, as if he feared being seen. My heart raced as I watched him slip out the door, leaving behind an air of unresolved tension. I wanted to call out, to ask if he was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. When the shop closed for the day, I walked home with a sense of foreboding that felt palpable. The streets were darker now, the shadows deeper. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I approached my building, I noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench outside, his gaze fixed on the ground. He muttered to himself, words I couldn't quite catch, but the tone was one of despair. I wanted to stop and ask if he needed help, but something held me back. Instead, I nodded in acknowledgement and hurried past, a chill running down my spine. Inside my apartment, I closed the door, leaning against it as I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The coffee maker gurgled softly in the background, but it felt like a far cry from the comfort it usually provided. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly. The street was dimly lit, the few remaining neighbors peering out with wary expressions. I could see the man from the bench now, speaking softly to the wind, as if trying to coax answers from the darkening sky. A sudden loud noise echoed in the distance, a sound that rattled my bones. I flinched, my heart racing as I turned to look outside, but no one else seemed to react. They remained frozen in their own worlds, pretending that everything was normal, even as the air around us thickened with unspoken fears. I returned to the couch, curling up with a book, but the words blurred together. Every creak of the building felt amplified, every distant sound an echo of the mounting dread that enveloped me. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the reality that was creeping closer, but all I could see was my uncle's scar, the one that had haunted my childhood dreams, a reminder of the darkness that lingered just beneath the surface. I took a deep breath, knowing that the fragile peace I had fought to maintain was slipping away, and the world outside was changing in ways I could no longer ignore. The morning felt different, the air thick with a tension that was almost palpable. I stepped out of my apartment, the familiar creaks of the old floorboards sounding louder than usual, as if even the building sensed the change. The street was unusually quiet, the absence of laughter and chatter from my neighbors hanging heavily in the atmosphere. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, the fabric feeling like a fragile shield against the world outside. As I walked toward the livraria, I noticed the shattered glass in front of Mrs. Koval's house. My heart sank. She had always been the first to greet me in the morning, her warm smile a constant in my routine. Now, her home seemed hollow, the once vibrant flowers in the window now wilting, a reflection of the creeping dread that was infecting our lives. I hesitated, the urge to knock battling with the fear of what I might find inside. Instead, I quickened my pace, convincing myself that perhaps she had simply gone to visit a relative. The livraria was dimmer than usual, the flickering overhead light casting erratic shadows on the walls. Mr. Bennett was hunched over a stack of books, his brow furrowed in concentration. I greeted him, but his response was distracted, his eyes darting toward the window every few minutes. Sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that had become all too familiar, but today it felt sharper, more urgent. "Did you hear about the bombing downtown?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I shook my head, the weight of those words settling heavily in my stomach. He glanced at me, his expression grave. "It's getting closer, you know. They say it's only a matter of time before it reaches us." I forced a nod, but inside, panic began to rise. The normalcy I had clung to was slipping away, and I felt the walls closing in. I busied myself with organizing books, but my hands trembled, the titles blurring as I struggled to focus. Then, a loud crash echoed from the street outside, a sound that shattered the fragile cocoon of my thoughts. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Dust filled the air, and I could see a plume of smoke rising from a few blocks away. The realization hit me like a slap. This was no longer an abstract danger, it was real and visceral, invading my world. "Stay away from the windows," Mr. Bennett shouted, pulling me back as glass rained down from the shattered pane. I stumbled back, breathless, my mind racing. I could hear the chaos outside, people shouting, doors slamming, the distant cries of sirens growing louder. "Is everyone okay?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of dread settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Mr. Bennett's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Who knows?" he replied sharply. "We need to get to the shelter. Now." We made our way down the stairs, the old building creaking ominously around us. Each step felt like a countdown, a reminder that the world outside was unraveling. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the sounds of panic echoed in the narrow stairwell. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, the reality of the moment crashing down like a tidal wave. As we stepped outside, the chaos enveloped me. People were running, faces painted with fear and confusion. I caught sight of a woman cradling a child, their clothes torn and dirty, and my heart twisted at the sight. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the sheer magnitude of the situation left me paralyzed. Then I saw him. A familiar figure stumbling toward me through the haze, his clothes tattered, eyes wide with terror. It was Peter, my childhood friend. He looked different, the light in his eyes dimmed by what he had witnessed. I rushed to him, but as I reached out, he collapsed at my feet, gasping for breath. "Peter, what happened?" I knelt beside him, grasping his shoulders, shaking him slightly. "Tell me." He looked up at me, his face pale and drawn. "They're taking people," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "They took my brother. They're raiding homes. It's not safe." His words pierced through the haze of shock, the implication settling deep within me. My heart raced as the realization hit. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, intruding upon my life with brutal force. My thoughts raced to my family. Would they be safe? Would they be spared from this nightmare? Suddenly, there was a loud explosion nearby, and the ground shook beneath us. I instinctively covered my ears, the sound reverberating. The scar on my uncle's arm was a permanent reminder of a past I couldn't fully grasp, yet it weighed heavily on my heart. I sat in my living room, the dim light casting long shadows that danced along the cracked walls, and felt the air grow thick with the unspoken truths that loomed over me. My mind raced, replaying the moment I saw him, the look in his eyes that spoke of torment and survival. The war had taken so much, but it was the knowledge of what he endured that gnawed at me, pulling me into an emotional turmoil that felt unending. I glanced at the clock. Its ticking seemed both cruel and indifferent, a reminder that time continued to march forward while I was stuck in this chasm of dread. The faint sounds of sirens echoed in the distance, a sporadic reminder of the chaos outside my door. I was trapped between the safety of my home and the reality of a world crumbling around me. My phone buzzed, a message from Peter, asking if I was okay. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Did I tell him the truth about my uncle? Would it burden him further? Or would it create a connection that might help us both? The truth was a heavy load. My uncle had survived the KGB's torture, but at what cost? Each day, I felt the weight of his suffering pressing down on me, a reminder that silence could also be a form of complicity. I thought of my family, of the way we had always kept our heads down, trying to survive the turbulence around us. But this felt different. This was not just a personal struggle, it was a moral dilemma that gnawed at my conscience. Should I stand by, honoring the silence that had been our family shield, or should I expose the truth, risking everything to protect those I loved? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, a jarring sound that echoed in the stillness. I needed to move, to escape the clutches of this introspection. I paced the room, my mind racing through fleeting memories of childhood, of laughter that seemed so distant now. I remembered the stories my uncle used to tell, tales of bravery and resilience. Yet now, those stories felt tainted, overshadowed by the knowledge of what he had endured. Could I still look at him with admiration, knowing that he had been broken, reshaped in the fires of torment? Outside, a group of children played in the street, their laughter ringing through the air like a fragile melody. I envied their innocence, their ability to find joy despite the shadows that loomed over us all. I felt my heart clench at the thought of shielding them from this darkness, but could I really protect them by burying the truth? My instincts screamed to reach out to my uncle, to ask him about his experiences, to learn from him. But what if his scars were too deep, too painful to share? What if I opened a wound that had long been festering, only to find that some truths were better left unsaid? My phone buzzed again, this time a notification from the news app one had tried to avoid. I glanced at the screen, headlines screaming of unrest, of families torn apart. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The world outside was collapsing, and here I was, wrestling with the weight of a single truth. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying my face in my hands. I could feel the tears welling up, a release I didn't want but desperately needed. My mind spiraled through the possibilities. What if I told someone who might not even care? What if it reached the wrong ears, endangering my uncle further? I thought of Peter again, of our shared history, the bond we had formed amidst the chaos. Could I trust him with this knowledge? Or would it alienate him, push him away into a world I could no longer follow? There was a part of me that wanted to scream, to voice the turmoil that churned within. I imagined standing in front of my family, sharing the truth of my uncle's scars, of his survival against the KGB. Would it bring us closer, or would it shatter our fragile facade? The unfinished meal on the table grew cold, a reminder of how I had neglected everything around me in this spiral of conflict. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the storm that raged within. The memories blurred together, the laughter of my childhood mixed with the cries of the present. I felt the weight of my uncle's story pressing on my chest, a burden I couldn't shake off. I thought about reaching out to him, asking him to share his truth, to let me into that dark world he had navigated. But what if his truth was too heavy for me to bear? What if it changed everything I thought I knew about him, about us? The silence in the room grew louder, filling every crevice of my mind with unanswered questions. I felt trapped, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty, where every choice seemed like a step into darkness. I couldn't afford to be impulsive. I had to tread carefully, yet every moment felt like an eternity. I wanted to act, to do something that would ease the weight on my soul, but the fear of making the wrong choice paralyzed me. I looked out the window, watching the children play, their laughter bittersweet against the backdrop of uncertainty. I wanted to shelter them, to create a world where they could remain untouched by the scars of war. But could I do that while hiding the truth? The dilemma swirled around me, a storm of emotions that left me breathless. In that moment, I realized that the path ahead was shrouded in shadows. I had to choose, but the cost of that choice felt insurmountable. The air was thick with tension as I stood in the dim light of my apartment, the shadows stretching long against the walls, flickering with the occasional burst of static from a nearby radio. Outside, the distant echoes of chaos seeped through the cracks of my sanctuary, reminding me that the world was unraveling just beyond my door. I could still hear Peter's voice, tinged with desperation, urging me to take action, to not let fear dictate my choices. My gaze drifted to the scar on my uncle's arm, a jagged line that told a story of pain and survival. I had spent nights staring at it, an unspoken testament to the horrors he had endured. The weight of his suffering pressed down on me, and I felt an overwhelming surge of frustration mixed with guilt. What right did I have to hold on to the truth, knowing it could shatter the fragile peace of our family? In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't stand by any longer, clutching the secrets that kept me paralyzed. I had to confront the truth, not just for myself, but for my uncle, for Peter, and for the children whose innocence hung in the balance. I grabbed my coat, the fabric rough against my fingertips, and stepped out into the uncertain night. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. I felt the cool air wrap around me like a shroud, my heart racing as I made my way toward my uncle's home. Each step felt heavy, the weight of my choice pressing upon my chest. I was terrified of how he would react, of the pain it might cause, but I had to believe that the truth was worth the risk. As I approached his door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I raised it to knock. The thought of revealing what I had learned, the fear of breaking the thin thread of our familial bond, paralyzed me for a moment. Then, a sharp crack of thunder rolled overhead, and I felt a surge of resolve wash over me. I knocked, the sound echoing in the silence. He opened the door, eyes wide with surprise. The familiar lines of worry etched on his face deepened as he took in my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. "I need to talk to you," I said, forcing the words through the lump in my throat. "It's about the KGB, about what you went through." He stiffened, the tension radiating off him like heat from a fire. "No," he replied, his voice low and firm. "You don't need to know that. You don't want to know that." But I pressed on, the urgency clawing at my insides. "I have to know. I need to understand. It's not just about you anymore. It's about everything that's happening now, the war. Peter, our families. We can't live in silence." The flicker of pain in his eyes was nearly unbearable. He stepped back, letting me in, the door creaking as it closed behind me. The room was dimly lit, the shadows casting an even darker hue over the memories that clung to the walls like ghosts. I could smell the faint scent of old books and the lingering bitterness of coffee, a stark contrast to the growing storm outside. "I survived for a reason," he said, his voice trembling as he took a seat at the worn table. "I thought I could protect you all by keeping silent. I didn't want to burden you with my past. But your past is part of us," I insisted, feeling the weight of my own words. "We can't move forward if we're haunted by secrets." He looked away, the scar on his arm catching the light as he ran a hand over it, tracing the jagged line. "You don't understand the darkness that lives in those memories. It's a shadow that never fully leaves you." "I'm ready to face it," I said, my own urgency surprising me. "I need to know what you endured, what we're fighting against. We can't pretend it's not real." The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle to keep the past at bay while the present threatened to consume us. Finally, he sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "All right, but you must promise me one thing. You cannot let this destroy you." I nodded, the gravity of his words sinking in. As he began to share his story, the air shifted, the shadows in the room flickering like the memories he recounted. I listened, absorbing each word as he spoke of betrayal, of survival, and the scars, both visible and invisible, that marked his journey through hell. As he spoke, I felt a surge of anger and sorrow swell within me. How could anyone endure such brutality and emerge so broken, yet so resilient? I could hardly breathe, the weight of his truth crashing over me like a tidal wave. When he finished, there was a heavy silence, the storm outside mirroring the tempest within me. I wish I had never survived, he whispered, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I did it for you, for your mother, for all of you. But the truth, it's a burden. I don't want to carry this alone, I said, my voice trembling. We're in this together. We have to fight. Fight for our families, for the children. We can't let fear silence us any longer. As the rain began to beat against the window, I saw the flicker of hope ignite in his eyes, a small light in the encroaching darkness. But there was also fear, a reluctance to embrace the weight of our shared truth. Whatever you choose to do next, know that it will change everything, he said quietly. There's no going back. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, the enormity of my choice settling heavily on my shoulders. I had opened a door that could never be closed, and with it came the realization that our lives would never be the same. I could feel the cost of my decision wrapping around me, the fear of what lay ahead battling with the urgency of the truth we could no longer ignore. As I stepped back into the storm, the rain soaking through my clothes, I knew I had crossed a threshold. The weight of my uncle's truth clung to me, a heavy shroud that would shape our futures. I had chosen to confront the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had also invited it in. A few weeks had passed since that stormy evening when my uncle finally shared the truth of his past. The world around me continued to spiral into chaos, yet within the confines of my small apartment, a strange stillness had settled. Each morning, I found myself waking to the same soft light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I would sit at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming before me, untouched. The aroma filled the room, but I found little comfort in it anymore. The stories my uncle told echoed in my mind, each one a haunting reminder of the scars that lay beneath the surface of his skin, in the skin of the world around us. I had thought I would feel lighter after hearing his truth, that the weight of his history would somehow dissipate in the telling. Instead, it anchored me, deepening my understanding of suffering and survival. I realized that the scars he bore were not merely his. They were a collective memory of pain that belonged to many, including myself. I often replayed his words, each syllable etched into my consciousness. The tales of fear, resilience, and the price of silence painted a vivid picture of a past that refused to stay buried. I felt a profound sense of responsibility, not just toward my uncle, but toward all those who had endured the unspeakable. The weight of his truth was now a part of my own narrative, a thread woven into the fabric of my being. I began to see my surroundings differently. The peeling paint on the walls seemed to tell a story of neglect, much like the unspoken traumas we all carried. I would glance at the photographs scattered around my home, images of laughter and joy, moments frozen in time. They felt like relics of a past that was slowly being overshadowed by the present's harshness. One day, I took a photo of my childhood with Peter, our faces bright with innocence, and gently placed it in a drawer, the weight of that moment too much to bear in the light of what I now knew. The war raged on outside, but inside, I created pockets of calm. I would sit on the balcony in the evenings, listening to the distant sounds of sirens and gunfire, my breath steady against the chaos. I began to write, pouring my thoughts onto the pages of a worn notebook. I wrote about my uncle, about the scars both visible and invisible, and the stories that needed to be told. Writing became my refuge, a way to process the emotions swirling within me. Each word was an attempt to reclaim some semblance of control in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed the untouched cup still sitting on the table. It struck me as a metaphor for everything I had been avoiding, the conversations left unsaid, the truths feared, and the pain that lingered like a ghost. I picked it up, feeling the warmth seep into my palms, and took a sip, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, embracing the discomfort that had become a part of my daily life. I decided it was time to reach out to Peter. I needed to share my experiences, to connect with someone who understood the weight of silence. I hesitated for days, crafting messages in my mind that never found their way to paper. Finally, I typed a simple message, "Can we talk?" It felt like a lifeline, a small step toward confronting the shadows that loomed over us. When we finally met, The conversation was raw and honest. We spoke of our childhood, of the innocence that had been shattered by the realities of adulthood. I shared my uncle's story, and I could see the flicker of understanding in Peter's eyes. We were both grappling with the same turmoil, the same struggle to reconcile our past with our present. It was a relief to unearth these buried feelings, to know that I was not alone in this journey. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed a shift in myself. I began to embrace the discomfort of honesty, even as the world outside remained turbulent. I learned to live with the scars, both my uncle's and my own, recognizing that they were part of our shared humanity. I found strength in vulnerability, understanding that there was power in the stories we chose to share, and in those we chose to keep close to our hearts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, I stood on my balcony, a letter in hand. I had written to my uncle, pouring out my thoughts and gratitude for his courage. I sealed it with a simple promise to carry his story forward. As I released the letter into the night air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a release of all the unspoken words that had bound me. I knew that life would continue to unfold with its complexities and uncertainties. The war would still rage, the shadows would still linger, and the scars would remain. But I had discovered a newfound clarity within myself. I understood the importance of bearing witness to the truth, of honoring the stories that shaped us. And as I turned away from the balcony, the wind gently brushed against my face, whispering of resilience and hope. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing. Stories like this need to be told and heard.